So I was looking for a circular polarizer for my trip to Yosemite a couple weeks ago, and I came across this 3-pack from a company called K&F Concepts. With a price of only $39.32 on Amazon, I thought that this filter set is probably one of the cheapest filter sets that you can find anywhere. And at roughly around $13 per each filter, it might be some of the cheapest filters that you can find, period. Now, it doesn't take that much to see online people recommending that you don't cheap out on filters, especially since you're usually applying them on top of pretty expensive glass in your lenses. However, I thought, for $13 each, is it really that bad? And sure, maybe they're right. You do get what you pay for in the end. But I had to see it for myself, right? Is there really that much to lose? I mean, it even comes with a carrying case. And, a good price for $39.32. And, well, the reviews online seem pretty good as well. So, well, here it is. Hi, welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're going to be taking a look at the K&F Concepts 3-pack of K-series filters on Amazon for $39.32. Is this deal too good to be true? Well, let's find that out today. Of course, a couple days after I purchased this filter set, it did actually go on sale even further with a coupon, so if you are interested in purchasing this filter set for yourself, you can get it at an even cheaper price now. Also, it's worth noting that every filter is a different size, so you need to buy the filter that's for the size of the thread on your camera lens. And in my case, I chose 77mm because that's the biggest thread that I had on my lenses. So in my case, I'm actually using this filter on my RF 24-105 f4L, but you might have a different filter size depending on your camera lens. And the general recommendation is probably to get the largest filter that you can for the largest filter size that you have. So if you have a lens like a 24-105 and that has a 77mm thread, and you have lenses that have smaller threads, it's generally recommended to buy the biggest one, since you can use something called a step-up ring, and that allows you to adapt the larger filters to smaller threads. So you can just keep one set instead of having to buy multiple smaller filter sizes, because that can get pretty expensive. Now, I also want to make it clear before we go into this that I did spend my own money on this filter set. I was not sent anything by K&F Concepts. I'm not sponsored by them at all, so this is 100% my own experiences, and this review is not biased whatsoever towards K&F Concepts. Well, with that cleared up, let's get this opened up. Well, you can see that the box is pretty shiny, and of course it has a description for everything that's included on it, and what it has, and what it does. Once you're inside, you're greeted, of course, with the filter set in its protective carrying case, along with 3 microfiber cloths that they provide as part of the set. And honestly, I've only opened one of the cloths, and it felt like it had a pretty weird texture. It's definitely different than the other microfibers that I've ever used. However, once I used it, I did find that it actually worked really well. So I was skeptical, but honestly seemed to be a pretty good product. For the main event though, let's take a look at this filter case. Now, it's pretty large, but of course it's because the filters themselves are also pretty large. This actually can change depending on what size filter that you buy. So if you do get the smaller size filters, then of course it has a smaller size carrying case. I think there's only 2 different variations for the carrying case. It also closes with this Velcro latch, and you can see it's pretty secure. Honestly, I didn't really have any problems with it opening or anything, so you don't really need to worry about that. Once you've opened it, you can see that it unfolds and you get to see all 3 filters in their own little kind of protective pouch. Every filter, as it is new, is sealed with a plastic kind of covering, but of course you can take this off. I already took this off to carry around the filters just because I don't really need them to be in a protective plastic since it's already in a case anyway. Honestly, they all feel pretty nicely built. It does have a metal kind of aluminum alloy frame, and the optics are actually glass, so you don't need to worry about it being like a resin or plastic. And there's also some ridges on the filters themselves, so it does make it a lot easier to take off. Obviously, with the price point of this filter set, there was some optical issues that I was expecting to come from using kind of just cheap filters and cheap glass. But for the most part, I think things are okay. But let's take a closer look at how those photos come out with this filter set. Now, taking these filters to quite a place to test, I threw them into the deep end going to Yosemite for a weekend trip. Now, all of these photos and videos were taken using a Canon R8 and an RF 24-105 f4L lens, so you have a point of reference as to what these photos were taken on. And well, the UV filter to start off, honestly, as expected, didn't really have any real effect on any UV haze in the mountains, but that's also expected. You see, most digital cameras actually have a UV filter as part of the sensor design, so I didn't really expect the UV filter to have any real effect on image quality. Maybe I was worried about it being kind of blurry. However, I didn't really notice any decrease in sharpness across the frame. Now, UV filters are definitely more useful on film cameras, where the film can be more prone to being sensitive to UV light. However, it's really not an issue on digital cameras, and most of the time people who do use a UV filter on their digital camera, they're mostly using it to protect the front element of their lens now. And yeah, I mean, sure, it's more protective. However, it's still going to be something that, you know, you just have on front of your lens. It's nothing that I feel like would increase or decrease the optical quality. Of course, if you're using a really cheap filter, then you might see a pretty big difference in sharpness. In that case, you can rest assured that this UV filter won't really affect the image quality of your photos or videos. However, I will say that it will introduce quite a bit more glare and flaring. And this is mostly an issue if you're shooting directly towards the sun, as the edges of the filter can sometimes cause a strong flare effect, and this isn't really something that you can remove in post. And honestly, it can be a creative kind of way of utilizing the filters, but if you aren't a fan of the flare or you don't want to have to worry about removing it, definitely consider not using the filters. Obviously, then in that case, it kind of makes the UV filter useless, other than in protecting the lens. I think though that I actually really quite like the flare that the UV filter gave. I'm not pushing for a perfect photo or perfect kind of a clinical approach to the way that my photos look. I do want it to have some sort of like a messy kind of analog feel to it. Obviously, I feel like that's all the rage right now, but using this UV filter and pretty much all of the filters in the set, you're gonna get that kind of flare effect. So just something to keep in mind. That's pretty much it for the UV filter though. Next, I want to talk about the ND filter, mostly because it's not really the one I use the most or pretty much at all. It is useful in some circumstances. Most of the time that you'll use an ND filter is for video. And the reason why is that if you want to use a wider aperture in bright situations, typically you can't adjust the shutter speed too much, otherwise your video can look a little too choppy, or your video might not have the natural kind of motion blur from having the shutter speed at the correct setting. Now, the filter set does describe this being an ND4 filter, and with that does mean that you should get around 2 stops, but from my experience using it and from what I saw online as well, it's more like 1 and 1.5 stops. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's also kind of not super useful. I mean, obviously it does have its uses, but you know, if you're looking for a darker ND filter, I really don't think that this is a 2-stop filter. The good news is that I didn't really notice any sort of color casts or differences in sharpness using the ND filter, so pretty much it's the same news as the UV filter. You're not really going to have a difference in sharpness across the frame. It is definitely my least used filter out of the set though. I do think I would have maybe omitted that filter from the set and perhaps provided some other kind of filter, maybe a stronger ND filter or just no filter from the set, and cheapen the price even further. I think that if you are interested in getting an ND filter, it would make more sense to get something that is able to be variable so that you can change the strength of the ND filter effect, because the reality is that the outside light isn't something that's going to be constant all the time, and you're probably going to have scenarios where you want to change how much darkness you're getting out of the filter. I do appreciate that they have included it though, as I know a lot of beginner photographers and videographers would definitely have a use for this. Now, for probably the most useful filter in this set, the circular polarizer, my thoughts on it are a bit mixed. I was genuinely worried that there was something wrong with my lens using the circular polarizer, and in this shot particularly with my brother, you can see that the top half is in focus, however the bottom half isn't. And obviously somewhere around his legs should be in focus considering it's at the same focal plane as the rest of his body, but it is definitely giving a weird kind of blur effect. It almost feels dreamlike in a way. And this isn't intentional. I did not want to have this effect. And you'll see in a lot of photos too that it does happen kind of sporadically. And it took me a while to figure out why this was happening. And what happened is actually that whenever you're shooting at a lower aperture, so in my case, I was shooting wide open on this lens at f4, and you're zoomed in, that's when it tends to have sort of a blur effect on portions of the frame. And yeah, I understand that this isn't the best optical quality circular polarizer, but that is definitely concerning. You might think that it could be due to the shutter speed as well. Maybe I had some motion blur. However, this was shot at 1/500th of a second, so that wasn't really a problem. And just to like make sure that it was the polarizer, I did shoot some photos with the polarizer off and no filters installed as well, and those photos came out pretty much tack sharp even at f4. So that's how I figured out that it was an issue caused by the polarizer. Honestly, I was really worried that my lens was actually decentered, but given that the fact that it only happened whenever the photos were taken using the polarizer, it kind of ruled that out as well. Now, luckily, these issues with the polarizer are pretty much mitigated if you're using them stop down and at a wider focal length. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on with the bending of light with the polarizer, but there is definitely some sort of optical imperfection with it. And I think that you can overdo it with the polarizer as well. There is some instances where photos definitely looked like super HDR in a way, and it's not the look I'm trying to go for. It was mostly just to use it to cut out the atmospheric haze. And for that, I think that the polarizer did a really good job. It's just you have to consider the weaknesses with it and plan out your photos a lot more carefully. Another thing to recognize as well, and this applies to pretty much every polarizer, is that if you're going to be shooting at a wider focal length, you have to be careful about color and balance in your skies, as rotating the polarizer can sometimes cause one part of the sky to be darker than the other. And I'll be honest, this is my first time using a polarizer. I knew that going in, but of course I'm going to make mistakes. And yeah, it did happen quite a bit. So it's just something to keep in mind. And it's not just something about this polarizer. It can happen with any polarizer at a wider focal length. I would also say that there is a slight color shift with the polarizer on. It does seem to shift more towards greens in warmer tones. And, you know, honestly, that can be something that some people might like. But if you're shooting in JPEG, obviously that does kind of limit the look that you can get out of your photos. You're gonna have to be careful with your white balance. But if you're shooting in RAW, obviously you can also change those colors. All things considered, while this is the most useful filter in the set, it is also the most problematic, unfortunately. With all these filters, honestly the price is really good though, and if I was just starting out as a photographer, I'd be really happy to have a filter set like this. And sure, I do intend to keep this filter set, just because I do think that there is some use out of it. I also intend though to buy a more quality circular polarizer in the future. I do want to tell you guys about the limitations of something like a cheaper filter set and why people say to spend money towards something that is more expensive though. However, I definitely appreciate the fact that K&F Concepts are making a filter set like this though, that is pretty accessible to most people, even at these large filter thread sizes and even at smaller ones as well. It's something that I think that reduces the barrier of entry to try out filters and different effects, so I really do appreciate that. Especially considering that quality filters are sometimes double the price of this entire pack, or sometimes even triple, just for one. Now, with all this in mind, would I recommend that you go out and spend your money on this filter set? Well, maybe. I think that if you are on a very tight budget, this filter set would do just fine. And I think where this filter set probably shines the most is if you're using glass that isn't as optically perfect. If you're using something like a kit lens that came with your camera, then I think that something like this filter set does make more sense. If you are using a more expensive lens though, with better sharpness out of it, then I would definitely recommend getting a better filter. That's not to say that the filter set in here is bad though. Like I said, the UV filter and the ND filter, I didn't have any problems with the sharpness or any color casting. However, obviously with the circular polarizer I did, and I think that is probably the most useful filter in the set, so it is a little bit of a bummer. But considering that it pretty much comes with everything that you need to get started with filters, if you have a UV filter, a circular polarizer, an ND filter, a carrying case with it, and cleaning cloths, this is a pretty good deal. But like I said, if you're using more expensive glass, definitely look towards a better filter. I have heard a lot of good things about a company called B+W, and I'll probably look at them for my next filter, at least for the circular polarizer. Oh, also one thing I wanted to mention too, the higher tier filters often are brass threaded, and the reason why is because the aluminum alloy that they use in cheaper filters can sometimes get stuck onto the threads of camera lenses, and that's something that you'll see online quite a bit. It is kind of difficult to take off if you don't have something like a filter wrench or a rubber band with you, but one trick I did learn online is that if you just apply barely any pressure and use all 5 fingers while you're taking off your filters, they are a lot more likely to come off. What happens is that a lot of people like to put pressure on the filter threads while they're trying to take it off, and it pushes the other edges of the filter onto the threads of your lenses, making it pretty much impossible to remove. So just apply even light pressure and you're more likely to take off those stuck filters. I also wanted to note that this is the cheapest filter set that K&F Concepts does sell. So the K-series is their more budget-oriented filters, and maybe if I had sprung more money towards like their X series, I think it's their X Nano series or something like that, maybe then the optical quality would have been quite a bit better. Maybe I'll look in towards that one instead as well. But of course, I couldn't resist trying this filter set at the price point that it came in, so at least now you know as well if a cheap filter set is worth it or not. Overall though, I honestly think that for the price point that this filter set does come in, it's honestly a really hard deal to beat. And you know, $13 per each filter, where else can you really get that for a filter that's made out of metal and glass? And sure, the ND filter isn't super useful. Maybe I would have wanted to have a variable ND filter, but it's really hard to ask for more when you're only paying essentially $13 for each filter. Well, that's it for today's video. What do you guys think of the K&F Concepts K-series filter set? Do you think it's worth it? Would you buy this filter set? Why or why not? Let me know down in the comments below. And consider subscribing if you liked what you saw for more content just like this. I am thinking about doing more photography-based videos, and if you guys are interested in that, do let me know. I'm not sure if I'll keep them on this channel or create a brand new channel for it. I'm probably more likely to keep them on this channel though, just so that I have a more like technology focused channel, especially since pretty much digital cameras are also technology. So, well, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.